Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this special edition of the Business Day Dialogue in association with ARIA, that is the African Rail Industry Association. My name is Andile Khumalo, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so, just to delve into a very, very important issue. Now, the purpose of today is to help create actionable dialogue. Actionable dialogue about what? About this important issue of third-party access in the freight rail sector, as of course announced by President Cyril Ramaphosa in October of 2020. This was part of South Africa's economic reconstruction and recovery plan to make sure that it becomes a reality. That this dialogue is no different to previous dialogues. We're going to get into a lot of detail, but we're going to try and focus on what action is required. Now, this important conversation includes different rail sector players, and it's going to be co-hosted, of course, by ARIA along with Business Day. ARIA is working very hard with various stakeholders around this issue of third-party access to make sure that it is actually actioned, especially now that it's almost a year since its announcement. We'd also like to take this opportunity to highlight all the opportunities and the benefits that various third parties can have in this access into a network. And of course, by extension, we're hoping that the impact will be new jobs, it'll be new business opportunities, and all of this will create even a contribution to the bottom line of Transnet themselves, who'll be opening up their network. The style of today's dialogue is that we have three highly esteemed guests. They will each be opening up by putting forward their own thoughts into the issue of third-party access. And then thereafter, we will be doing a Q&A. And this is where you play a role, ladies and gentlemen, because I am hoping you can send us your questions. And of course, you're going to put those through into the Q&A chat at the bottom of your screens. And I will make sure I put that into my panel. Right, let me now introduce you to this highly esteemed panel I speak of. First up is the Chief Executive of ARIA, Mesila Nhlapo. She's the Chief Executive of ARIA, the African Rail Industry Association, holds a BCom degree in marketing and also an LLB, and she's had 20 years experience in manufacturing and technical business development. Joining her is James Holly, who's Chief Executive of an independent rail operator by the name of Traction. And he's got 11 years experience in the rail industry. He's a chartered accountant, so he can do some numbers and be sharing some graphs and stats with us. And he did all of this at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And then also joining us from the Office of the Deputy Minister of Finance is Dr. Sean Phillips. He's the team leader for Operation Vulindlela, which is seen as quite key in the implementation of this third-party access. And he's got 20 years experience in senior management positions in government, including Director General of the Department of Performance Monitoring and Evaluations in the Presidency and COO of the Department of Public Works. That's our panel, ladies and gentlemen. We look forward to hearing from all of them. In fact, without any further ado, let me hand over to the Chief Executive of ARIA, Mesila Nhlapo.
Thank you so much, Andile. Good day to everybody. African Rail Industry Association is a representative of companies that are original equipment manufacturers, rail operators, rail services companies, and that are operating in the rail sector. We are a fully fledged export company, export council that is established and supported by the DTIC. Rail plays an essential role in supporting productivity and increasing sustainability in the country's economy. However, transport challenges have become costly due to infrastructural delays and therefore affects a nation's progress. South Africa and the continent needs to have an efficient transport system and allow greater private sector participation as a form of strengthening our participation to increase intra-Africa trade. On the 15th of October, 2021, the President Cyril Ramaphosa announced in the Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan that we will be encouraging private sector business participation, and will be allowing third-party access onto the core network. Those are some of the most exciting news in 2020. And we understand that any developing country, if they can't get their logistic cost in place. Therefore, that does not benefit the industry. We believe that third-party access will have a potential to create thousands of jobs within the railway sector and upstream, driving a massive economic benefit for companies that require additional rail capacity to transport their goods. We are aware that Transnet has been unable to keep pace with the growing demands of its customers. In the case of Tazara, the media had reported that Transnet may have contributed to the loss of 9 million tons of coal. However, Transnet is not alone in this challenge. African countries have the same problems and are introducing third-party access onto their network to bring in capital, to grow capacity and expertise to service their growing economy. And expertise, by the way, we have a lot here at home. There is a question around third-party access and privatization. There's a difference. And I'd like to go into what third-party access is. Third-party access policies requires the owner of natural monopoly infrastructure facilities to grant access to those facilities other than that of their customer. And this policy provides for opportunity to maximize access and to utilization of the rail network. In some cases, the network is only 30% utilization. So we need to change that. Whereas to privatize an industry involves selling state asset. So there is no transaction between the state and business. There is no selling of any state asset. We're merely asking for grant us access because we want to be partners with government. The days of talking past each other with government has ended. We need to talk to each other to save this economy. Right here next door, during the pandemic, when we had locked down our ports, Tanzania Railways and Zambia Railways under the umbrella of Tazara, they continued with their operations. And therefore, some of the traffic that may have come our way were diverted to Dar. So they recently signed an open access agreement, Tazara, between the two countries. And interestingly, the recent Tazara board had announced that it notes that there's been a 19% increase in terms of freight flows from the last financial year into the current financial year. And then they said the board noted that despite a global economic slump due to COVID-19, the freight volumes have increased, say plus minus 90,000 metric tons to recorded to the previous and the previous one to 106,000 tons. So there is an increase in terms of growing freight from that point of view. It's the same board at Tazara that now expect that the revenue from open access is going to increase by 25%. So 25%, it will be an add-on to their revenue of their normal revenue that they achieve as an organization. In their first year open access, Tazara anticipated an additional 200,000 metric tons in an annual freight over and above the normal 170,000. So it's no brainer. It's already working in Zambia and Tanzania, and there is no reason whatsoever why we should not be actioning our third-party access. Operation Vulindlela implemented a joint initiative with the Presidency for Structural Reform. And in order to sustain our economy and recover to address the underlying causes of low economic growth. And these structural reforms have been delayed for several reasons, but the agency has increased. We need to support a swift economic recovery. As the name says, in structural reform, it is intended to change the economic structure, reduce input costs, lower barriers to entry, and increase competition. Competition is healthy for the country. Vulindlela is not a new plan, but rather an implementation tool to the existing plans, looking to the National Development Plan. Most of the priorities, they require little or no additional resources and are budget friendly. Although structural reforms are necessary to restore growth and confidence without additional government resources, third-party access is budget positive. We do not need money from government. We actually begging government, we want to give you money. And in the 2019 Transnet integrated report, it provided that Transnet, to fulfill its mandate, Transnet needs to grow beyond its current core. The freight forecasts indicate a doubling of freight demand in 20 years, an increasingly important role for ports, rail, pipeline, and national freight system. Organic growth of the current business will not yield the required funds to meet future investment. Transnet, the future, need to participate in various levels of freight system. Even though it will not directly provide each step in the value chain, accordingly, it needs to nurture its core technical competencies and promote competition to benefit the development of the national freight system while encouraging critical strategic partners, including third-party access to augment and deliver the total value chain. So third-party access is not something from business only. It is from we can refer to the 2019 Transnet integrated report. Structural reform through third-party access must shift to a more optimal transport mix, with more transport by rail and allowing private operators to access the core network. We recently, on the 25th of July, the president announced that we need to accelerate the structural reforms. And we as the rail industry, we are willing and able. There is nothing in law that prevents the government to grant us third-party access today. This has been confirmed by our legal counsel. This has been confirmed by the railway safety regulator. So we encourage government to grant us access. Stella President avula amagate.
Sicela uPresident avule amasango. Well, there you go. That is the message from ARIA. Thank you so much, Misila, for that. Very, very clear about the fact that third-party access is not privatization. Very, very clear that there are no legislative changes that need to be made for this to happen. And also very, very clear that this is budget positive. We don't need money from government. In fact, we will be making money for government. Speaking of government, our next speaker is Dr. Sean Phillips, and he comes from the Office of the Deputy Minister of Finance to share the views of government on this very important topic. Sean, over to you, sir. We got to unmute first, you see. It's the line of the decade, unmute.
Thank you very much, Andile, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm representing Operation Vulindlela, which is a unit in government, which has been established to expedite the implementation of key structural reforms, including in the freight transport sector. The units that I'm a member of is situated in the Presidency and National Treasury, and its role is to monitor the implementation of the structural reforms, to provide support and coordination where required, and to escalate issues where necessary. We're not actually implementing the reforms. The reforms are implemented by the relevant line function departments and government entities. So with the reform that we're discussing today of third-party access to freight rail, the key responsible departments are the Department of Transport, implementation of policy as the shareholder department for Transnet. And the key implementing entity is Transnet and Transnet Freight Rail. Government as a whole is committed to creating a competitive and efficient freight transport system in South Africa. The reforms that have been prioritized to achieve that objective include enabling third-party access, the establishment of a single transport economic regulator, the corporatization of the National Ports Authority, improvement of the competitiveness and efficiency of the ports, which includes more private sector participation in port operations, as well as finalizing and implementing the white paper on national rail policy. There has been announcements regarding progress with some of these reforms recently. For example, the Minister of Public Enterprises and the President in June announced that the National Ports Authority will be corporatized, and an interim board has since been appointed for the corporatized Port Authority, which is an important reform because it creates a better enabling environment for private sector participation in port operations and a better environment so that all port operators can be treated equally and none of them given any favor. The finalization of the white paper and national rail policy, as well as the establishment of the transport economic regulator, are both important to enable private sector participation in rail to thrive in the longer term. Both of these are in process. The bill for the transport economic regulator is currently before Parliament, but we don't believe that the introduction of third-party access on freight rail needs to wait for the bill to be completed, and I'll come back to that in a minute. In addition, we don't believe that it needs to wait for the white paper on national rail policy to be finalized either. There have been previous drafts of the white paper which envisaged vertical separation and the creation of a rail infrastructure manager as a state-owned company that would own and manage the rail network. In other words, the draft white paper envisaged an entity similar to the National Ports Authority as the owner of our ports for the rail sector, or similar to the ISMO in the electricity transmission grid, which is currently being implemented, with all rail operators being treated fairly and on an equitable basis by a regulated and unconflicted or independent rail system owner. So you can hear from what I'm saying that the government is moving in the various sectors, including the ports, freight rail, and electricity. It's moving in a certain direction of enabling more private sector participation, the aim of which is to have increased competition, which should result in more competitive freight transport and also more reliable and better quality freight transport services. And the same motivations apply in the electricity and port sectors. While there's consensus within the public sector regarding these broad policy thrusts, there's still some contention regarding the detail of implementation. For example, while the draft white paper envisages vertical separation between infrastructure and operations for freight rail, Transnet favors a vertically integrated rail operating model. However, we believe that these differences are not an insurmountable challenge in the process towards achieving third-party access in rail. For example, similarly to the corporatization of the Transnet National Ports Authority, which an independent infrastructure manager for rail could be created as a subsidiary owned by Transnet with an independent board, giving confidence to private sector investors and participants in third-party access without hurting Transnet's financial position and creating a potential bailout problem for the fiscus. While the white paper on national rail policy is still being finalized and the regulator is yet to be established, Transnet and Transnet Freight Rail are preparing to introduce third-party access in the meantime. Transnet has indicated that Transnet Freight Rail will separate its accounts into operations and rail infrastructure by September 2021, in other words, by the end of next month, leading to commercial separation by August 2022, which would in turn enable the accurate costing of slots for third-party operators. And that is a key milestone for Transnet to be ready to offer priced slots to third-party operators on the freight rail network. As Operation Vulindlela in the past few months, we have had many interactions with stakeholders regarding these issues, including with the Departments of Transnet and Public Enterprises, with Transnet and Transnet Freight Rail, as well as with ARIA. These interactions are continuing, and our focus in continuing with these interactions is to try and find ways to accelerate progress. We would hope that the time that it might be possible for the timeframes that have been put on the table by Transnet, which I described just now, to be accelerated, because we share the views of ARIA that this is an urgent reform, which in the interests of the country and the economy and a competitive freight rail system needs to be implemented as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sean, for those words. Very, very clear about some of the progress that I guess government in general is making. I love the point that you made, and you made a reference between not only the transport freight industry that we are obviously gathering for today, but similar things in ports, similar things in electricity, as we've heard on other platforms. So it's a very good thing that government is moving in this direction, and there seems to be movement. And thank you also for those timelines on Transnet, which is, I guess, the ultimate implementer of all that we speak about. You made it very clear that DOT, in terms of policy, is going to be involved. DOE, as a shareholder representative, is going to also be involved, but it comes down to Transnet and specifically Transnet Freight Rail to make sure there's some execution. So I know to those timelines, and I'm pretty sure my panelists and also some of the guests that have tuned in with us today are going to make reference to that to see how we can indeed accelerate them further. Next up is the CEO of Traction, my good man, James Holly, who will be talking, I guess, from the perspective of an operator already in the industry, just about the opportunities that lie for all of us, and particularly the guys that are already in the space, insofar as it relates to third-party access into the Transnet network. James, over to you, sir.
Adele, thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody that's listening in. I think, you know, when you're looking at a perspective of an operator, the first question that I think we need to ask is this something that is going to be a meaningful structural reform? We all see the need for it, but are we going to make it a meaningful structural reform? And the two sub-questions under that I would like to address now, I think there are some more things that we can address too, but the two things that I'd like to address now is, are there operators out there that can really practically implement the structural reform? And is there existing capacity in the South African network today that is going to enable a meaningful number of train sets to come onto the network to supplement the existing Transnet service? So to answer my first question in terms of are there operators? So Traction is one of a few operators, private operators that are based in South Africa. To give you a little bit of background into Traction, we are more than 30 years old. We're the only ISO 9001 2015 certified operator that I know of on the continent. We have a 5-star safety rating, and we are a rail safety regulator, permit holders already in South Africa. We operate in 8 countries in Africa. We are operating under third-party access in Africa already, and with great success. And I think very importantly, it's been very successful for the infrastructure owner, which is the state-owned enterprises on whose track we use in Africa, earning significant incremental cash flows from what they were earning before. That's before we look at the upstream benefits of having the rail services that we offer in those jurisdictions. Our customer base is extensive and has been built up over 30 years. It includes most of South Africa's major mining houses, most of South Africa's big freight forwarding businesses, and most of the regional big freight forwarders and mining houses and industrial companies. We have a training school which we use to try and solve the skills deficit problem that we have in our industry. We train drivers, and we train highly skilled locomotive technicians. We've trained more than 600 drivers and more than 70 highly skilled technicians. We have large institutional type shareholders. We are 49.9% Black owned, and our shareholders have an appetite and a real interest to invest into the sector. And it's off the back of that, following President Ramaphosa's announcement of third-party access in the Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan in October last year, that we announced a 1.5 billion rand build program into locomotives and wagons, most of which, interestingly, would be assembled and manufactured in South Africa as part of a first phase up to 14 to 17 billion rand in investment in locomotives and wagons. Now, what's interesting about that investment is it's just touching a small portion of the total amount of trains that would need to come in to service what we believe is the freight opportunity in South Africa. Then to answer my second question is, to what extent is there capacity in the South African network? So what I'm going to do is just show you two maps and one graph that I think can illustrate the point very nicely. So what you see in front of you is the South African rail network. It's an extensive network. We have about 36,000 kilometers of installed track. Transnet has about 21,000 route kilometers, so those kilometers between major cities. It's equivalent to that of Germany, and about 85% of Africa's rail track sits in the southern tip of Africa in our republic. If you have a look at this map, it's segmented into the major business units of Transnet. So if we have a look over here, you'll see the iron ore line, the famous iron ore line where Transnet moves the longest trains in the world. Okay, this is the red line. The blue line is the coal line down to Richards Bay. Okay, and the green line is what's called the general freight business. The black lines are the branch lines, which are largely are no longer in use. Okay, to replace the South African network would cost 1.5 trillion rand. To put that into perspective, that's about 10 rupees. So now if I move on to my graph, and you can see that from 1949 up to the prior year, Transnet have just announced that they've gone down to 185 million tons, which is quite a significant reduction. But up to the prior year, you'll see a general increasing trend in total rail volumes moved in South Africa, which I'm sure will surprise a number of people. What's interesting, though, is the segmentation of that. If you look at the blue line over here, this is the volumes that are moved on the coal line, and the red line over here are the volumes that are moved on the iron ore line. And the green line is the general freight network. And as you can see from about 1974, there's been a significant reduction in actual tons moved. This is not a proportional graph, actual tons moved on the general freight network. So now what that says is, if we go back to our map of the South African rail network, we today are moving about close to 60% of the total rail volumes in South Africa are moved on this small red line, the iron ore line, and the small blue line, which is the coal line. And about 40% of our volumes are moved on the vast general freight network. So what that then anecdotally tells us is that there is significant capacity in the network. The fact that we were moving more volume on that network, significantly more volume on that network in 1974, of course, tells us that. But then we've also done a study through the Rail Association into what is the real capacity of the network. And you'll see on the key bulk lines in South Africa, or the key core lines in South Africa, all of the lines in green are less than 30% utilized in the opinion of ARIA. So that means, and if you have a look at those lines, and then all of the lines in yellow are less than 50% utilized. If you look at those lines there, there's significant capacity in the South African rail network. The line down to East London, Port Elizabeth, Cape Town, the lines into our regional trading partners, Namibia, Botswana, the North-South corridor, and across to on the Maputo corridor, are all less than 30% utilized. And that says there's a huge amount of capacity in the South African network. A way to think about that is like AXA building OR Tambo International Airport and saying only SAA can land there. And they've got 100 landing slots, 20 landing slots are used by SAA. 80 of those landing slots then are not generating revenue to AXA. All of these slots at the moment are not generating track access fees to Transnet, which means that this massive network of Transnet is a big burden to them because they are responsible for the maintenance thereof. And that is why we as private operators in South Africa are very excited about this opportunity to layer on trains. And we do believe it's something that isn't going to require any investment by Transnet or the fiscus to prepare for private trains entering onto the network.
Thank you very much, James. Loud and clear, speaking about the role of the operators, asking the two questions and presenting answers. Are there operators out there, number one, and do we have enough capacity to absorb the players that are going to be coming into the network insofar as our local network is concerned? In case you're wondering, just in terms of sheer size and scale, one of the things that I learned is that around 80% of Africa's installed base is actually here in South Africa, which of course is an indictment of what kind of infrastructures in the rest of our continent, but also puts pay to the argument of how well endowed we are when it comes to proper infrastructure that's really just available for the taking. We are opening the questions now. Please go ahead and drop me all the questions you might have. based on the three guests who've already made their cases forward. I see that we've received a couple of questions. I will be putting them through onto the panel. But perhaps just to reflect on what's been said, Messila, let me start with you. You heard Dr. Sean Phillips giving you some specifics in terms of timelines from at least a Transnet perspective, which is quite important. They are the implementing agency after all. To what extent has there been communication between the industry body that you had and the DOT and the DOE and Transnet themselves in communicating these timelines? And frankly, do you believe them?
We have a fantastic relationship and one of the few accessible ministries, starting with Treasury. They're always welcoming and to listen and to provide input. And that is quite key. And working with the Office of the Deputy Minister has been quite important for us. And to further acknowledge that we do have a listening government. Department of Public Enterprises, there's an open door policy. We actually had Minister Pravin Gordhan addressing our AGM this year. So in terms of that, DOT worked with them on a policy side, and hence we believe that single transport economic regulator is not a requirement to start this process. There are talks between ourselves and Transnet, and we're trying to get an individual within Transnet to work with us on a study that we have commissioned, which is the practical implementation of third-party access. Like I've said before, Andile, we don't talk. We talk and we work. We implement. If there's one thing that business is good at, is to implement. So where we are is we want to work with government. We have the answers already. And as a matter of fact, if government were to, or rather the SARS, if they were to choose to get money today or in 12 months, I am quite certain that they will choose to get money today. So if there's any assistance that is required by government to facilitate this, the pricing and all that, all those costs is their infrastructure. They have those costs. There is absolutely no reason for 12 months. As far as I'm concerned, if was a president in this country, the 1st of September will start with the implementation of third-party access. Thank you.
There is absolutely no reason for another 12 months. That's the word from Messila, Sean. It's very clear to all of us listening to this webinar that third-party access is a win-win for everybody, right? You yourself, in your earlier comments, Sean, made the point about how this is in the interest of this country and its citizens. And on the back of Messila making the point, why is it taking so long? Perhaps let us in on what are the potential or the actual practical impediments that potentially government is dealing with, including, of course, the SOE in question, Transnet, is dealing with in implementing this, and why it may take as long as another 12 months.
Thank you, Andile. Firstly, I would want to say that we would also like to see the timeframes accelerated. And as I indicated, we're in the process of engaging with DPE and Transnet to see if that might be possible. I can't speak on behalf of Transnet and Transnet Freight Rail, but in our engagements with them, they've indicated that the process of separating the accounts and separating all the costs between operations and infrastructural costs is a complex one. And that is the main reason why it's taking a long time. But as I've indicated, we agree with ARIA that possible acceleration should be looked at, and we are engaging with DPE and Transnet to try and achieve that.
I see. And at what level do you think, Sean, that kind of accountability between kind of yourself sitting in the Deputy Minister of Finance's office in Operation Vulindlela, which I must tell you, by the way, in case you do not know, the whole country has big hopes for you and your team. We feel like this is the real implementation platform of government policy. So what kind of framework should we look to create the accountability between the industry bodies, between private players, and between government and, dare I say, Transnet themselves? How do we keep each other accountable?
Well, there is an existing accountability system in terms of our constitution. DPE and Transnet need to account to Parliament, but government also needs to account to the public in general. So I think the more engagement, the better, and the more of these kind of seminars, the better. I think it would be a good idea to arrange a future seminar in which DPE and Transnet themselves are also involved. So there can be an ongoing consultation process, and so that accountability that you're talking about can be achieved.
Absolutely. I think that one is definitely one for noting and making sure that perhaps through Mesila's office at ARIA, it is implemented. A further discussion with other role players that are responsible for implementation. James, let me come to you because a couple of questions have been coming through the platform here from some of the viewers that are joining us. And it's really around the intricacies of how this third-party access will work. I've got a question here from Brandon Williams, who's asked the question, will the access to the rail infrastructure work similar to the USA? All right. Now, Ms. Sila already mentioned a few other countries right here on our continent where it has worked successfully. So maybe give us a sense. Are there case studies globally that prove that this actually works? And how does it work in other countries?
So in Delhi, the case studies, I think, on every continent on the globe as to how third-party access has worked there. So there's a huge body of learnings that we can take from the rest of the world as to how this has been rolled out. I think there's some very interesting examples in Australia where you have a similar environment to South Africa, where you have the infrastructure owner who is also an operator that is then allowing slots for other parties to come on. And I completely agree with George. I think that the freight network should stay within Transnet. I think it's an important base of their earnings, and I don't think it should be stripped out. I don't see the requirement for it. We've got very strong legislation in South Africa that protects against monopolistic behavior, and I think Transnet's very sensitive to that. It's exactly the same basis that we are operating in Africa as well. We operate in networks, and we operate alongside those SOEs who are also operators in those networks. So it's a model that works there as well. What you have to be very careful of is you have to make sure that the infrastructure owner is not prioritizing their trains over and above the private trains. And that's a very easy thing actually to implement. Trains, thankfully, move very large bodies of freight. They're very transparent. We know exactly where they are on a constant basis. It's not like the road industry. Each one of our trains takes about 100 trucks off the road. And so we're not monitoring 100 trucks, we're monitoring one train. It's very transparent. The train systems are transparent systems. We understand where the bottlenecks are and where in the areas where we operate very quickly. We start engaging on those bottlenecks to improve them. We have great relationships with customers, and because the customers understand us, believe in us, and trust in the service, they start investing in their loading and offloading facilities. And I think when the first private trains start running into private facilities in South Africa, and start turning those trains around in timelines like 5 hours to get 100 container trains spun around, that things in South Africa are really going to start moving and changing in the freight environment.
Thanks for that, James. But that leads me to a question for you, Ms. Sila, which is, if this all makes so much sense, if it is also accretive and earnings enhancing for Transnet, why has it taken so long for us to get here? And two, did Transnet need government? Did it need the president in October 2020 to make this announcement for them to come around and say, okay, now we're going to do it? If it was commercially sensible, why wasn't it done anyway?
And let me start from the country's perspective. If companies like Traction in October that the president has announced this and they put money on the table, let's say yes, 17 billion rents, we are ready to invest. Then we say no, 12 months, we're still thinking about it. Now, if Traction has customers have access to the core network, they employ more people, and in return, Traction is going to order rolling stock from local companies, the same local companies that have been relying on Transnet for business, but now you're changing the business. You're not only relying on two state-owned entities, we actually relieving government for over-reliance of private sector to government. So there's another benefit there. But most importantly is that you can't pay for education from the feast must fall generation and not have jobs on the other end, or at least an opportunity for somebody that is an engineer to be able to start their own business. So that is from the bread and butter. People are hungry today. They want to have jobs today. They don't want to be stripped of their dignity by to queue for 350 rands. Let's give the South African men and women their dignity back. On the case of Transnet, I've never worked for government. I don't know what it takes to make decisions. And I hope that we always hope there's leadership coming and go. And we always hopeful that the leadership in place will make quicker decisions because they work in the best interest of the country. But we have placed ourselves as implementing partners. If they need us, we already have started doing work. If there's something that they don't understand, we are here. We've always communicated that to the office of the group CEO, to the office of the CEO FTFR, to the department, the DG at DPE, to even the minister himself. We even wrote to the president, by the way, and suggested that we form a rail advisory committee because to plan for the future of this country, government cannot do it on its own. From the president's office, we have not received a response, and I would like to use this platform that, Mr. President, Ms. Sela and the team are here. We want to talk to you. We have solutions, and we want to work in the best interest of the country.
Loud and clear to the president. Sticking with government structures, I have a question for you, Sean, and it's coming from Dave Williams. And he asks a pretty pragmatic question, I thought. Is it not a major structural and government obstacle that Transnet does not fall under the Department of Transport? You were explaining to us exactly how it works with the DOT being responsible for Transnet policy, but having the DOE as kind of the shareholder representative of Transnet. Would it not just make sense if Transnet was reporting directly to Transport, or is there any logic that it's not the case?
Thanks, Andile. It's the Department of Public Enterprises that Transnet reports to as the shareholder department. So there are arguments both ways, and different countries have different systems, but it's generally considered good practice in terms of governance to separate policy from implementation. So the Department of Transport does provide, is responsible for policy and provides a policy framework, whereas the Department of Public Enterprises specializes in the governance of the large SOEs, and they report to, and so you have a centralized shareholder role within government in the Department of Public Enterprises. And the advantage of that is you can try and make sure that there's standards, that there's common standards of governance across the different large state-owned enterprises, with the aim of them being well governed. I'd just like to add as well, in response to the previous issue that you were talking about, why it has taken so long, etc. I think one point to make is that, as we all know, unfortunately, our country has been through a period of state capture in previous years, of which Transnet was also badly affected. But now there's a change of leadership and there's a change of focus, and there's much more focus now on these structural reforms now, both from the president and the minister, and implementing them from the Minister of Public Enterprises. And that's why I think we've seen in the past year or two much more emphasis on this and movement now with regard to implementation of third-party access.
Great stuff. Thanks for that. I beg your pardon. I did mean DPE and not DOE, but that's very clear. That's very, very clear. You are saying that there's been, it is best practice to separate the implementation from the policy. But I guess the follow-up though, Sean, is you have to concede that it does create what can be seen as an extra layer, where, others may think that, two departments being involved is less efficient than one department.
Yes, as with many issues in government, there are arguments for and against on both sides. But the government is tending towards following the practice of separating policy from implementation, and looking at the advantages of having the large SOEs under a single shareholder to make sure that there's standards, that there's common standards for shareholder control and governance across the SOEs.
Very diplomatically handled, Mr. Phillips. Thank you so much. Next question is for you, James. It's a question around just the capacity. You touched a little bit on, let's call it the ripple effect of this big policy move on, for example, the manufacturing industry and how wagons that we have a capacity to manufacture in South Africa, how that in itself will become kind of a transformed industry. Question here is, how does our rolling stock quality compare to our African partners? And is the track gauge adequately standard?
Thanks. I think both very important questions. So firstly, there's workshops in South Africa that have been manufacturing locomotives for more than 100 years. Okay, the first train ran in South Africa 162 years. This is an extremely well established industry in South Africa. It's at a very low point at the moment because of the impact of the state capture era, but it is a very well established industry in South Africa. The way that our industry has worked in the past is that we have worked with the world's big OEMs to manufacture in country. So the likes of General Electric and Progress Rail, the big Japanese electric locomotive manufacturers, manufacture their locomotives in our workshops in South Africa with a high local content that naturally comes into those programs. So in terms of how does our rolling stock compare to the rest of the continent? Well, prior to the Chinese orders, almost all of the locomotives that were procured and owned in South Africa were of the highest quality in the world. And I see no reason why in future, when we go into the new build programs to layer on the additional capacity from third-party access, why any of the operators wouldn't continue to work with the best manufacturers in the world. So I think the quality of the locomotives that will come in will be the latest technology and the best available. In terms of what it means for the South African rail manufacturing industry, at the moment there's one huge problem, is that there's massive counterparty exposure. You've only got one customer in the form of the South African government, which is broken up into two parts, Transnet and PRASA. If you have a multitude of customers, okay, like you have in the world's advanced rail markets, like the United States, for example, they have extremely advanced manufacturing capacity in those industries because they don't have that counterparty exposure. They can bet their business on the fact that there's going to be orders next year. They don't have a case where there's 1,064 orders in 1 year and nothing for the next decade. So I think that's what's really going to benefit in terms of the rail manufacturing industry. You take away the counterparty risk exposure. At the moment, the DTIC is regulating local content into the SOE procurement. I don't see there's going to be any requirement to regulate local content when you take that away, because the business case for investment into major manufacturer and then all the subcomponent manufacturer in South Africa just makes sense.
Which is interesting. Which is an interesting comment, James. And maybe Sean, let me just come back to you quickly. Which is an interesting point around how this, if it plays out the way James suggests it may very well get government to rethink its own policies in trying to ensure that the local economy is competitive. The point James is making is you don't have to regulate local content if you can spawn or ignite a local industry that will drive itself purely from just the commercials. Hey, Sean, and I think that's an interesting case study. What's your take on that?
I agree with James.
In short.
Yes, no, it makes sense.
Absolutely, it does. That's a very interesting point.
It makes sense. Yeah. If you create the right enabling environment and if there's a market for the local industry to thrive, you don't need to regulate local content. It will happen on its own because it's the sensible thing to happen in the market.
Absolutely. Absolutely. On that note of local content, Misila, a question has come from Melusi Mbofu. And Melusi is asking, will an external operator from other countries have access to the slots which will be opened by Transnet? Now, there is an interesting question. If you say third party, whose third party is it? Does it close off at the borders of South Africa, or is it all third parties in the universe?
Look, we have a regulator in the country, and they set the standards who can access the rail network, under which conditions. And as Traction has said earlier, they are a permit holder. So if you're operating in South Africa, the rules do apply, and suppose anybody that can subject themselves to the rules, they'll obviously most likely be able to participate. Taking the case of Tazara, is between Zambia and Tanzania. So that is the two countries that are working together. There is a strong case for us to work with the region. If we are not able to work with the region, how are we then going to integrate the continent? But Anil, I want to touch as well on the 1064, the Transnet contract. Whether we call it state capture or not state capture, it's important to understand that this contract has cost the South African market billions. We have companies that have invested in South Africa on the back of local content. The companies are closing down today. There are companies that I have initiated meetings with the Chinese. Their drawings came in Chinese. There are companies today that have survived because of the export market. And interestingly, when we do business and the missions on the continent with the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, we get asked the question, where are you, South Africa? You guys have been leading the rail industry all this time. What happened to you? The quality of rolling stock? In Angola recently, we were taken to an area called Malange. They have one of the oldest rolling stock that came from South Africa. They say, no, they don't want to get rid of this stuff because the quality is very good. And they still expect that from South Africa. Now, 2015, the United Nations says South Africa is going to be a hub for rolling stock manufacturing. 2015. Now, we can only be a hub if we control our destiny as a country. We can only be a hub if we grow the skills in the country. We can only lead the integration of the continent and increase intra-Africa trade if we control the destiny. The African Union says the potential, the development of the continent must rely on the potentials that is offered by Africans, particularly its women and youth. So if we are not investing in these people, if we bring technologies that are not going to our own benefit, we are in serious trouble. So I'm pleading with our government that here's a partner, a willing partner. We want to work, we have solutions. And that's what I'm saying on this, that we do have solutions.
All right, loud and clear, Ms. Sila, loud and clear. But before I move from this point, I'd be very interested in government and from an operator perspective. Allow everybody to participate, South Africans only, Africans only, the whole world. James, let me start with you.
And yeah, I'll give you a very practical example. There's trains that the private sector is running from Ndola to Dar es Salaam. Okay, the distance is about 2,000 kilometers. And that train operates pretty slowly, but the trains get between Ndola and Dar es Salaam, moving copper out of the copper belt in 4 to 5 days. Okay. By comparison, the trains that operate between Ndola and Durban move between 24 and 42 days to do that trip, which is about 600 to 800 kilometers longer. Okay, and the only reason for that is that you've got integrated operations to to Dar es Salaam, and no integration in the operations down to Durban. And when you think that north-south corridor is one of the key trade routes that's moving South African content and South African product up into the region, that's really not very good. And then, you look at South Africa's trying to position itself as a manufacturing hub for Africa. Look at Germany. And there's no way that Germany could be the powerhouse that it is today, the manufacturing powerhouse it is today, without extremely efficient trade routes into the rest of Europe. So if we as South Africa want to position ourselves effectively as a manufacturing hub, we need efficient trade routes into the region. It doesn't make sense, therefore, that you say, okay, only South African operators operate in South Africa, and that you can't have regional trains entering into South Africa. Mercedes point us, we've got a rail safety regulator that's in South Africa. The regulation, the safety regulation in South Africa is extremely strong. It's the implementation thereof that sometimes leaves a little bit to be desired. As long as the the regional operators can meet the South African safety standards, they should definitely be operating into South Africa and vice versa. And if we do that, the day that we have a train that leaves Durban and that same train set stays together all the way through to Ndola is the day that we're going to stop being stuck behind copper trucks every time we go on the N3 or the N1.
Absolutely. Speaking on those trucks on the N3 freeway, Nisila, I have a question that perhaps you can also help us on from a statistics perspective. I know James touched on it. I think he said something like, what one train, how many trucks it takes off the highway. Irma is asking, in the concept of third-party access, Greg is asking, how much general freight is in our roads that is usually carried on rail? So in other words, if we get this right, what are the numbers? And feel free, Sean and James, to weigh in as well. What potentially do we see as a benefit to just an average South African now? I guess there's a safety issue as well, insofar as not so many trucks. And I guess there's a cost issue in the fact that, I may pay less for certain products that would, load logistics costs that would now hopefully be cheaper. Nisila?
Yeah, firstly, I would like on the truck issue, my 12-year-old believes that it's my fault that there are so many trucks on the road. In terms of statistics, years ago, there are numbers that are available, particularly from the JSE point of view. There was a time where the grain market, 80% of the grain market was transported by rail. The concrete silos will always have a rail link to it. So now those figures are reversed. All that grain is on roads. We've spoken to a few companies for the petroleum sector as well. They say, no, they are moving to road because rail is not reliable. And it's not true. Rail is reliable. It's just that at the moment, Transnet may not necessarily have the capacity of what the economy demands of them. So those are the stats that we're looking at. There will be, as James said, that on the general freight lines, only 30% is utilized. So 70% is lying there wasted. So there's I'm sure James can share more numbers, but the study that we're working on will come out with more numbers.
Let's wait for the study because I do worry about time. Just to go through some of the questions that were raised that I think you've already answered. Greg, or rather Putela had, I think it was Irma, I'm sorry, had asked the question in the concept of third-party access, who carries the cost for ready lines for use? I guess the model is that, that the lines that are going to be used belong to Transnet. So we as third parties would pay essentially a fee to Transnet for the use and access of those lines. So the balance sheet of Transnet is quite important. I think James also touched on that. And Dumi, who I think gives us a nice roundup to our conversations before I ask you guys to give your final thoughts. Dumi says the time to negotiate with Transnet is now. Waiting for all moving parts to align will take way too long. We cannot work in parallel and work through a lot of unknowns and uncertainties. How can government assist? And maybe, Sean, it's a good time to give you an opportunity to just share 20 seconds, your last thoughts on this particular issue, and maybe looking forward in terms of what your office and your colleagues at the Project Office of Vulindlela are looking to do in this particular issue of third-party access to the rail freight network.
Thanks, Andile. I think I'd like to focus on the point that you made earlier about the statistics around how much freight rail is moved from rail onto roads. It's halved in the last 10 or so years. The amount of container freight that was on rail has halved, and all of that container freight has moved to road, which, as you indicate, is inefficient for a variety of reasons. And as Marcella indicated, the main reason for that is not because road is cheaper or rail is too expensive. It's because the service being provided by Transnet Freight Rail is not reliable. And the logistics companies say that if they could get a reliable freight rail service, they would switch back to rail quickly. So that's the imperative behind why we need to accelerate enabling third-party access. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you for joining us. James, your parting shot as you switch off your screen. I don't know why. Did you run away? There you are. Please, your parting shot.
And yeah, I think the volumes of freight are really big. The ARIA study is, we think it's about 58 million tons of freight that can move from roads to rail as soon as the capacity is available. Interestingly, there's some studies out of Stellenbosch that are indicating it could be a lot more, as much as 120 million tons. That's a huge body of freight. The locomotives and wagon investment to meet that would be between 45 and 45 billion rand and 100 billion rand of rolling stock that would need to come in. That's a huge investment. And I just think, though, that we focus so much on what's happening in rail, and we forget about the upstream benefits. In rail, we are an enabler of upstream industry. We only exist because there's an upstream industry. And in rail, we're good at moving big volumes for big business. And when you unlock this structural bottleneck to growth in South Africa, I don't think we fully appreciate what growth we're going to be unlocking upstream. You know, when we put on a train set for, let's say, a major mine, we will be employing maybe 50 people, maybe 100 people to put on those train sets, depending on the scale. That mine can employ 5,000 people. And that's the enabling impact of having rail capacity in our country. And that's
maybe that becomes the theme of the conversation that Sean has been recommending, along with the other role players like DOT, like Department of Public Enterprises and Transnet Freight themselves, to talk about, call it, that catalytic role of the rail freight industry. The rose amongst the thorns, our leader, Chief Executive at ARIA, you get to have the last say.
Absolutely. I have changed my title from CEO to CVO. You can't be in this business and lack vision and not see the future. And my appeal to government, starting with the operator, be accessible. It shouldn't take much long for Hellman, for Tambo Springs, and any other companies to get in touch with you and sit on the table. That doesn't work. Be accessible. And lastly, I would like to acknowledge our sponsors, Penrod, Saflog, and MMTP, and the members of ARIA, of which have been a great support. Not forgetting the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, our partners, Railway Safety Regulator, and TITA, which is a training, education training authority. And on the party shot, that we are ready. It's one industry, it's one voice, third-party access, we are ready today.
We are ready today. Well, you heard Mr. President Vula Masango. People are ready to access the network and help our country grow and create economic opportunity for as many South Africans as possible. As Misila said earlier on, people are hungry now, and these are the levers that are really within our reach, and we have no business not opening up the tap and letting them happen. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us this afternoon. I'm pretty sure this conversation will continue. Look out for coverage of it also on the Business Day as part of the Business Dialogues series. But as also Sean mentioned and James supported, perhaps there should be continuous conversation around this issue. Another 12 months is another 12 months too long. Thank you again for joining us. From me, Andile Khumalo, your host, it's goodbye.